Hello everyone, I'm Chris Sullivan. I'll be your host and moderator for the latest installment of our Swiss Re Corporate Solutions Risk Management webinar series. I see a lot of familiar names in the attendee list, so to those of us joining us again, I welcome you back, and for those here for the first time, thanks for spending the next hour with us, and we hope you enjoyed today's discussion on how understanding business interruption exposures can strengthen supply chain resilience. No doubt a critical focus area for corporates and risk practitioners alike, and one where we read about the negative impacts of supply chain fragility in headlines on a weekly basis. Today, I'm very happy to welcome our speakers, Michael LaRocca, Head of Property and Specialty Lines for North America, and Gary Johnson, a Senior Risk Engineer here at Corporate Solutions. Before we get started, just a few quick logistical reminders. Attendees are in listen-only mode, so we encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation. We've left time at the end to address those questions. And lastly, if you encounter any technical issues, just press Control F5, and that'll reset the platform and get things going for you again. Okay, so now without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael LaRocca for some opening remarks.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Good morning and good afternoon. Thanks for attending our webinar, which we're excited to present. My name is Michael LaRocca, and I have been with Corporate Solutions since 2018. And prior to that, I was with several carriers, always on the underwriting management side, and started my career as a risk engineer. When it comes to claims, usually the most complex and at times contentious claims has to do with the time element component, time element being the BI and the extra expense. Understanding and presenting the actual loss sustained is challenging for your direct loss locations and even more so for your contingent BI, suppliers and customer locations. A lot of this uncertainty can be reduced, if not eliminated, with greater understanding and transparency pre-binding. Today we want to walk through that process, highlight items to consider, review some basic definitions again, look at loss events, understand business continuity management, and understand that this is a combined effort here, as you see, underwriting and risk engineering, and that is telling of what it takes for this process to be done correctly. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary to get started.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Chris, and hello, everybody. So today we're going to cover a number of different aspects that are key to this whole BI and supply chain analysis. So I'd like you to think a little bit about James Reason's Swiss cheese model. Each element can serve as a protective barrier to help you avoid major surprise loss events. So getting things right allows for effective risk transfer. It prevents you from purchasing too much or too little insurance coverage. It helps promote a positive and efficient claims process, something that everybody wants. And this can really be the backbone of effective business continuity management and ultimately supply chain resilience. You know, on the other hand, if you get things wrong and you have holes in the Swiss cheese, you know, you have holes in your layers of protection. So hopefully this presentation will give you some food for thought so you can avoid these pitfalls. So a few years ago, I was asked to lead a newly formed business interruption team within our risk engineering services group. And one of the first things I did was I drove up to Connecticut to talk to Doug May. Doug's our head of property claims for North America. And I told him that Res wanted to do more with regards to BI, and I just asked him for some advice. And this is really one of the first things he said to me was how, you know, again, one of the biggest issues we see with BI claims is that the values are not reported correctly. So, you know, everyone in this business, risk managers, brokers, underwriters, we all need to know what the definition of business interruption is. So I don't know if you can quickly pick out the correct answer or answers to this multiple choice question, but the correct answer, or I should say answers, are 2 and 4. So I like to think of 2 is the addition method. You're starting with profit and you're adding continuing expenses that would keep going after a loss. The Number 4 is what I like to call the subtraction method. You're starting with sales and you're minusing non-continuing expenses. So it's important to realize that cost of goods sold is an accounting or a financial world term, and it doesn't fully equate to non-continuing expenses. Depending on the type of business that you're in, COGS can include a number of different expenses that would continue after a loss. Most of the examples on this slide. Direct labor would be part of your BI claim if ordinary payroll coverage is purchased, and utilities are semi-variable. Some utility costs directly rate to production, but not all. This slide's a simple depiction of the variation between BI and COGS. So let's say you're in a high-margin business. Pharmaceuticals is a great example. Your BI figure will be significantly greater than your cost of goods sold. If you're in a low-margin business, so the newspaper printing industry is a good example, your BI figure will actually be a good bit lower than the cost of goods sold. A BI claim would probably, in fact, include in large part a lot of extra expense. So I wanted to point out that different terms are used in our industry which equate to the same thing. So non-continuing expenses are also referred to as variables or variable expenses as they vary with production levels. So this is a list of items that vary with production and would cease if 100% of production was down. I won't read the list, but take the first example, which should be pretty obvious. If you're not producing, you don't need to buy any raw materials. So just think of costs, again, that are directly linked to production and realize that some of these are semi-variable, like utilities, as I mentioned. Continuing expenses are also referred to as standing charges, fixed costs, or fixed charges, depending on where you are in the world. This is a nice long list of examples. Let's just take one, advertising. So even if you have a pretty bad loss at a key plant, I don't think you're probably going to pull your ad campaign. So again, the costs continue. This slide is specific to a manufacturing type of operation. Let's take pots and pans, for example. The listed costs are generally figured into the selling price with the desired amount of profit added. And the first 4 costs are what would be considered COGS for financial reporting purposes. Service or retail businesses are a bit different as they're not manufacturing their goods, they're purchasing them. So their cost of sales, which is similar to COGS, would be the cost of their merchandise plus payroll and salaries. So at the end of the day, if you want BI or lost income insurance, you really should complete a BI worksheet or worksheets. If you're a small company, maybe just one worksheet is enough for your entire company. For a large company, you probably need to fill out multiple worksheets, one for each of your key production plants, for example. So we can provide these. This is a worksheet based on the gross profits, or the UK form, the additive method, if you will. And this is an example based on the gross earnings, or the ISO form, using the subtraction method. So now you may have a good overall BI figure, but the second potential hole in the Swiss cheese can be that you haven't quantified the BI exposure on a location by location basis. So perhaps you just don't really have a good handle on your exposures, or you just haven't allocated the values correctly. So you need to consider your exposed supply chain to do this correctly. So this is just one example of what we see. In this statement of values, you may notice that the PD and BI values, which are columns X and Y, they trend from high to low in a very symmetrical fashion. This is because, in this case, the BI values, they actually represent 40% of the PD value for each location, which has nothing to do with the actual exposure to each of these plants. So doing things the right way is what we like to call the supply chain method. So when you have only one plant, it's really easy. I think people get this. So in case one, you have one facility and you have two buildings. The raw materials go into building one. You get an intermediate, goes to building two, and you sell things to your customers. So people usually get this right. They figure out, hey, we have $100 million in BI, and that's allocated to that plant. Where people start to get confused is when the supply chain is comprised of multiple plants, which is often the case. And keep in mind that your supply chain actually includes your suppliers and customers. So case 2 is simplified, but it does consider two production plants. In this case, they're 50 kilometers apart, so they're two separate sites. So assume in this example that $50 million was allocated to each site. So it was broken up evenly. So the key thing to realize is that the exposed BI is still the same. If plant A or plant B burns down, the exposure is still 100 million. It's not 50. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should allocate 100 million to each plant. That would be reporting double the BI. And there isn't really a generally accepted way to do things. But when you allocate the values, just try to make interdependencies as clear as you can. You might allocate all 100 million to plant B, for example, since the finished products come from that plant, and then have a statement somewhere saying that the BI for plant A is included in the plant B BI value, as an example. So I'm going to turn things over to Mike now, who's going to discuss supply chains in more detail and highlight some relevant case studies. So it's all yours, Mike.
Thank you, Gary. And as you just heard from Gary, it's so important to do BI and to get that location by location. But as you see now on this slide, have you gotten all the locations? So here's just an example of just how complicated this can be and the analysis that needs to be done. So truly a whiteboard session to sit down and really look at and map out from the spreadsheet to a board to really say, have I gotten all the locations? Your own, your suppliers, and your customers. So the detail here is tremendous. Then, after you have all your locations and you feel comfortable with that, you then start to think about, okay, do I have all the exposures at all these key locations? At times we focus on an insured location and those hazards that exist for that location. But what about we have a location that's more susceptible to winter storm or susceptible to military and government situations, okay? Or the electric grid is of worse quality here or there. So really it comes down to then not just getting the locations, but then really starting to plan and think about the various situations at all those different locations. Clearly, the first thing to do is, as we do, occupancy hazards at your locations. What do you have there from fire and explosion? Is it laid out correctly? The human element exposure, poor construction. So that is the occupancy hazards that you need to address for your locations. And then beyond that, you need to think about the external factors. Okay, cyber attack. A good time to be mentioning this with the recent attack just last week. That took place, and it's a growing concern for us, for our industry. We're really looking at the external factors, as you see here, pandemic, natural hazards, blackouts, and you'll see some of these that we're going to now highlight in some of the recent losses that have taken place for our industry. Understanding those inherent risks based on geographic location is huge. As always, our industry, we do a very good job learning from past and looking to the future, okay? What are we about to risk we're about to assume? We think about the past and what occurred, and then we learn from that and we grow from that. So let's take a look at some of these events over the years. Going back to 2011, we're going to start with quake in Japan. And here you'll see I'm pulling up some of the contents about this situation, okay? Power outages caused production factories to close. Even 6 months after, even 6 months after, there was still power outages for 13%, which is tremendous. Energy capacity was still offline. 9 months for global semiconductor production to pick up again. And we all know how important that is in our industry today. 2011 it was, and it's even more so today when you think about these chips and where you find these chips in everything from gaming to autos to everything that's out there today. Same year, now we're talking about the Thailand floods in 2011. And the period of time, look, over 158 days. The production of everything from cars to computer disks and drives, the concentration that we found in this area was tremendous. And some of it, unfortunately, by surprise, that so much of the auto industry was requiring this area for this technology, for this color paint. 19% of Thailand's manufacturing firms were part of the global production networks. It's almost 20% taking part of the global supply chain, which is tremendous. Okay. Automotive exports down greater than 50%. I mean, just staggering to think this event in this part of the world to have that kind of an impact overall is tremendous. Now we move forward not too far, right, to coronavirus, COVID-19 just last year. Unfortunately, something many of us on this call are continuing to live with, and we're still feeling the effects of this virus and what this meant, okay? Major production slowdowns. We just think about China alone and what was there, what with regards to almost 25 million vehicles, okay, in that area, the fourth largest source of automotive parts and imports, okay? Clearly, the COVID-19, the impact that this has on global supply chain, still to be determined, right? I mean, it has put pressure on when you're talking about the world economy, major parts of the economy being shut down for manufacturing shut down for 3 to 4 months, shipping to be shut down or slowed down for 3 to 4 months. Just what impact that has and what strain that puts on supply chain is tremendous. And any losses that follow are now already going to be impacted by a system that's already stressed tremendously. Swiss Re, the Institute, came out with a publication in 2020 basically stating, comment down there, COVID-19 is adding momentum to restructuring of global supply chains. When we talk to our insurers, we need to discuss, okay, so you understand your supply chain to be X. What is it like now post-COVID? Because it might be worse. It could be worse. It probably is worse, considering that one of your suppliers might have been down for 3 months. So really to take that post-COVID view is important. And then going forward, to think about it and to add a pandemic like this into your thought analysis when developing a supply chain. Quickly into this year, right into February, we have another situation, which is the Midwest storms, the Texas storms, the freeze in February of this year. Okay, I mean, this was statewide. This was a large area. This was a grid they needed to do a rolling blackout, so this grid was going to fail for good, and that had a major impact, obviously, on energy prices. This had a major impact on our insureds that were out there trying to, protect freezing temperatures, protect their facilities, grabbing energy that all of a sudden has, tripled or quadrupled in price, and they were really struggling. And at times they could not keep up with that. They were just simply not prepared for this kind of a freeze over this prolonged period of time, and the amount of damage was tremendous. Still, again, very fresh with regards to supply chain. The trickle-down effect on this, we're still going to start to see the effects of this and the losses that will come from this. Then this year again, here we look at the Suez Canal and the Ever Gifford situation with that one ship. Here, canal that took 10 years to build, took one ship to block it. The larger these ships get, the taller they get, almost acts as a wind sail, and a breeze basically pushed this thing into a situation. And we all saw the photos from the satellite, which showed the backup from entering the canal and leaving the canal, those hundreds of ships that couldn't get through. And then obviously the ship itself, the way it was wedged in there was incredible. Most of this obviously is going to be marine driven. Normally from a property damage, there's no direct property damage, so we're not thinking of much loss from a general property exposure. Cargo delays generally not covered, but again, we're talking about 10% of the global economy flowing through this canal and what impact this has on a system that was already stressed from COVID. You have a situation like this. We were lucky that obviously 6 days was a long time, but this was not multiple weeks. And there was a route around this, which was helpful too, that if it was prolonged, you would have seen ships take a different route. What if this happened to the Panama Canal, where the routes around are not really, reachable in a period of time that might work for that cargo that's being shipped? Again, the financial impact on this can be huge. Still not yet completely determined what this would look like, but this could be big and this will be big. How do we understand our raw products, how they ship, where they ship, what the contingencies are for future events like this? I'm going to now hand it back to Gary. We're going to get into business continuity management.
Thanks, Mike. So now to the heart of the matter. How can you control and mitigate all of these crazy supply chain exposures? So first and foremost, business continuity management, which really needs to be formal, tested, and you have to consider all of these worst case scenarios. As the Swiss Re Institute has recognized, many companies with large global supply chains are looking to restructure them. Automation and technology enhancements have worked well for a number of different industry sectors. If you can afford it, having parallel or duplicated manufacturing operations is rock solid. If your key suppliers or production plants are all located in a flood-prone estate in Thailand, it might be a good idea to think about diversification. And many companies today are looking to simplify, relocating their key production sites closer to their home base, that is near and or reshoring. And of course, there are insurance solutions, which Mike will talk about in a little bit, but first let's talk a little bit more about business continuity management. So BCM is a diverse and extensive topic with hundreds of different acronyms, and I think it confuses a lot of people. It's important to realize that BCM is overarching terminology, and there are a few site-specific and corporate management programs that feed into the whole thing. So take emergency response plans at the local level where there needs to be planning, training, equipment. Disaster recovery is the terminology applied generally to your IT infrastructure. So think about data backup, emergency power for your key data sites. Do you have hot and cold sites? And then there comes crisis management. How well prepared are those at the top levels of a company to deal with catastrophic events? To help simplify this, I'd like you to think about 5 key steps. There's the risk assessment piece. That's the first step. You're going to assess your risks. Then you're going to conduct a business impact analysis. Okay, so you've looked at the risks. How does it impact your business? Now you're going to come up with a strategy. Makes sense. You need to document it. That's what the business continuity plan or plans are. And then one of the most important parts, the training and the testing. And we'll talk about that. So we don't have enough time to go through every step in a lot of detail, but I wanted to take a snapshot of each. So regarding step 1, risk assessment, this is a relatively simple example slide to help you visualize the process. On the left-hand side of the spreadsheet image, there is a list of both natural threats and human threats. So the probability of the threat was rated on a scale from 0 probability to high, and the impact was similarly rated. Probability times impact gives you an inherent risk number score. Next, the current state of readiness was gauged, any current mitigation measures already in place, and this was ranked low, medium, or high and used to reduce the number score. So you're left with this residual risk ranking and an overall threat rank to help focus priorities. Once you've identified your key threats, you have to look at the impact to your business in a more detailed manner. So what are these activities, these threats going to do to your business? And this comes in 2 pieces. You have to think about the quantitative analysis, how much revenue could be lost and what would be the increased cost to operate, as well as a more qualitative brainstorming where you think about, damage to your brand, your reputation. Are there any legal or regulatory issues? The key deliverable is your final conclusions. What would be the critical things to do after the event you're evaluating? What are the recovery priorities? And an important part of this is thinking about the time requirements and objectives. We call them RTOs, recovery time objectives. So I get a lot of questions about evaluating suppliers and how to gauge the associated business impact. So maybe this is a little more difficult than looking at your own location. So I just threw out some questions for you to consider when you're thinking about evaluating your suppliers. The first key is the percentage that you're dependent on the given supplier normally. Then, depending on the worst case scenario, what's the maximum period that your supplier could be down for? Do they have any other sites where they can make up production? And if they do, what would be the extra cost? Once the supplier is back in operation, can they increase production perhaps to provide a higher percentage of what they gave you before? What's the maximum period for which your business could be interrupted? Are there alternative suppliers, and how much makeup capacity do they have? And again, at what extra cost? What are your inventory levels of the raw materials or materials you get from this supplier? So that could definitely offset or delay lost sales. I know it's not practical for every type of company to have a lot of inventory, but this can be a key strategy. A lot of my pharmaceutical clients, they have weeks and weeks and even months and months of their APIs and their finished drug products is a key strategy. So you need to just look at all the alternative ways you can think of maintaining sales, and if so, again, you need to look at the extra costs. So on to step 3, what is the strategy with regards to dealing with the residual impact? So this is a good list of different strategies and what they are or what they mean. Diversification is the best, having a backup site established that is completely ready to go with no delay. Replication, almost as good. You have your backup location, you can resume operations, but there would be minor delays involved, maybe relocating your employees to the new site. Standby, you still have a backup location identified, but more significant actions are needed. Now, I wanted to mention when it comes to post-incident acquisition and especially do-nothing strategies, the old, that's why we buy insurance. These are obviously not as good, but joking aside, these could be acceptable strategies if the risk to your business is minimal. And then the last one, subcontracting, utilizing a toller or even a competitor to perform a given process and in turn, produce intermediate or final products for you. Definitely viable. It's a common strategy. I just like to tell people that, these options need to be fully vetted beforehand. You need to understand what makeup capacity you're going to get from going this route, and you need to confirm it on a regular basis. And again, understand the additional costs. At this point, it's time to document everything, right? You're just writing down the plan. So it should include your purpose and scope, objectives. Okay, what activates the plan? Who's responsible for activating the plan? What are the roles and responsibilities? What are the exact procedures to implement the plan? Okay, the communication requirements, the local plant talking to corporate talking to the media, internal and external interdependencies and interactions, resource requirements, and then testing and training requirements. So that last step, very important, and this seems to be where we get the majority of blank stares. It seems that companies struggle with how to test the game plan. So this is a great slide that shows the kind of exercises that you can do to test the effectiveness of your BCP with simple definitions and the pros and cons. So we do realize that for some of you, full-scale, parallel, or interrupting tests may not be practical, but the top 3 listed really should be readily doable using a checklist, a structured walkthrough, a desktop type of simulation. And if the stakes are high enough, if the BI exposure, the exposure to your business is really that great, a full-scale type of exercise can definitely be warranted. So I'm going to hand it back over to Mike so he can discuss insurance solutions in a little more detail. All yours, Mike.
Thanks, Gary. So from an insurance solution perspective, we all know that from a BI perspective, in order to trigger BI, we need to have physical damage, right? And that's for the incidents at a policyholder. The same is true for incidents of suppliers. So you're going to need to have that physical damage in order to trigger contingent business interruption insurance. However, there are products available, most notably non-physical damage BI products that can be considered. Now, these are quite complex, and it's tough to generalize these products because they're very specific to certain industries. Transportation, let's say, from air versus rail, hospitality, and even pharma. But these are definitely vehicles that can be considered if coverage is provided that doesn't trigger any physical damage. These can be set up indemnity-based products like traditional insurance. Okay, so you could have certain triggers. It basically pays out like a regular insurance policy. Or it could be set up on an event basis as well, too, which is more of a parametric style. So the non-physical damage is a route that can be placed as well. Again, tough to generalize as far as limits that are provided out there because it's very specific to that industry and to the specific needs of that industry. If you think of hospitality and you think of coming off of COVID-19, going forward, yes, I would think that is a cover that they're going to need to consider and are going to consider buying when it comes to their hotels being closed and loss of revenue because of a non-physical occurrence that has basically shut down air travel and access to their facility in a tremendous way, and or just completely closing their facility and shutting it down. So NDBI is definitely a cover for the future that we see. Gary, back to you to finish up.
Okay, Mike, thanks. So the final issue, if you will, can give rise, if you have not addressed the things we've just outlined. Inadequate analysis of your BI and supply chain exposures, which means that we are in the dark as well. And then maybe your desired or proposed terms or for your insurance policy can be a bit unrealistic. And this is the kind of things that leads underwriters and risk engineers alike to a lot of sleepless nights. So very low BI retentions, contingent BI, extra expense, these sublimited covers where the sublimits are very high. You may want indirect coverage. You want CBI for suppliers of suppliers of suppliers, right? Tier 2, Tier 3. So again, when we don't understand the exposures, it makes it difficult, as far as our appetite for this kind of thing. So, to wrap this up, it's just important to realize that BI insurance without BCM is just not enough. We can't cover you for market share loss, a damaged reputation, if you lost your license to operate. So at the end of the day, doing these things right is really a win-win for everybody. And just with that said, before we take questions, I'd like to turn it back over to Mike one last time for a few final comments.
Thanks, Gary. An excellent job. I appreciate your time here. As I said in the opening, right, this is underwriting and res coming together, but it even takes more than that. You heard claims, and it really takes a village to get this done and to complete this process, which is so important, right? And it's the insured working with the broker, working with their carrier, working with all these various units to really understand and see what needs to be understood before that loss occurs. So again, the complexity of it, I think we laid it out pretty well here, very well here actually. And then we also just provided you with opportunities to consider as far as what happened in the past could happen again. But we all do know, obviously, there's scenarios out there that are going to come up that are going to surprise us. So how can we understand those better? How can we kind of develop those and really work those into our system and really say, what if this happens here? If I break this chain here, what happens? I wanted to end it with that before handing it over to Chris.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much. We have some questions that have come through that I'd like to ask you and Gary. But first, thanks for running us through I think a really thought-provoking and informative discussion here. So let's get into some questions. So you mentioned customers in your supply chain comments, not just suppliers. Can you expand on this? What would you suggest with regards to evaluating customers in your supply chain? So Gary, why don't you take this one? And Mike, if you have anything to add, please feel free.
Sure, Chris, thanks. Well, I think that's definitely something that at times is overlooked. I find myself talking about suppliers a lot more than I do customers, but I do think when you do this whole this business continuity management, you definitely do need to look at your customers. There's probably not as much that can be done as far as all these strategies that you're going to come up with. But I mean, obviously, if you have one key customer, maybe 90% of your profit is from one customer. If you're able, of course, to diversify and get new customers, that of course would be, to me, hopefully the main strategy. I know every company can't do that, but I know I read a lot of 10K financial reports, and usually this is something that's always discussed in those reports, is the breakdown of customers, and is the company dependent on only a few key customers. So I think it's just important to recognize that you definitely need to look at it, but there probably is not as much that can be done depending on the type of business you have.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Gary, I would echo that. I was just going to add, Chris, I would echo with regards to the customers. I feel like there's always an element of surprise there for us when we see a loss that occurred, even a recent example of a fire in Japan at a chip plant just March of this year. And we know that that was a key supplier for some of our insureds. And then we start to see some of the customers too that are starting to submit claims as well. So it's tough to quantify that, not as easy as a supplier, but it is very important to have those discussions and take that through to the customer side too and see how it is all connected, because ultimately the world has gotten a lot smaller and everything is connected, unfortunately.
Thanks, Mike and Gary. Mike, this is the question I'll put in front of you here. Does Swiss Re have resources to assist us in developing business continuity plans? Yes.
As you saw from Gary, even just going back to some of the basics, when you talk about, understanding BI per location and helping to assist and to provide a BI worksheet. So we could be there from the beginning. I always use the term whiteboard, right, to sit and work with you and understand what's your SOV, filling out a BI worksheet. And then it even gets a little bit more complex. We now have something that we call RDS, Risk Data Services, where we are now trying to work with the data that's available, your data that's available on your locations. It could be your insured locations only, to start with that, or it could be all of your insured locations and all of your suppliers and customers. So you have access to this data. You share that data with us, not losing control of it. We take that data in a structured way, and we now apply our risk insights to that data. And then we share that with you. So you could start to then really see what those impacts are with regards to NatCat, with regards to the environment and sustainability, and other factors that you might not normally think about when it comes to your locations that expose you.
Thanks, Mike. Gary, I'll turn this question over to you. To what extent do you feel supplier locations should be audited? And can you provide these services?
Sure. Well, the impact analysis is probably when you're going to figure out just how important some of your suppliers are. So if, that's going to really predicate just to what extent you're going to go to. I mean, again, there are clients of mine where the suppliers are so important that they really treat the supplier almost like an insured location of theirs, and there's all kinds of auditing that goes on by, where you might audit your suppliers, and then you might have the insurance company like us audit the suppliers, and we can definitely do that. We might not be. I don't want to give people the impression that we could go perform maybe a quality ISO audit or a FDA audit or something like that. But when it comes to all the traditional type of property insurance things, going to a supplier site, as long as we can get cooperation from the supplier, we can look at the whole natural hazards, geo hazards, all of the occupancy factors, the human element. So certainly we do. I don't know how many people on the call realize, but Corporate Solutions does have a lot of risk engineers, very qualified technical people all over, and we can certainly do this kind of thing for a client.
Thank you, Gary. We had a couple of questions come in around NDBI coverage. So let me just read one of them. So is non-physical damage coverage available in this market? And is it a standalone policy? Mike, why don't you take this one? And actually, Mike, before you do that, let me just mention to the audience, we did a webinar last year on non-physical damage business interruptions, and we can link that in the follow-up email. So if you want to go back and watch the recording, we walk through some case studies to make it a little bit more tangible and tactful. So we'll link that when we send our follow-up thank you email to everybody. But Mike, can you comment on our capabilities and the availability of the coverage?
Yes. Thanks, Chris. And I think that's a great suggestion because we did have a separate webinar on this last year. And as I said during the presentation and when I gave the example of the hospitality, so yes, NDBI coverage are still available. However, of course, we need to really take an even harder look with regards to certain coverages that are required, especially when you think about infectious disease and the pandemic and all that we learned there. How do we obviously accept that risk, whether it's indemnity or it's a parametric? How do we accept that risk at a cost, at a limit that's, of use for an insured, right? You could just imagine the type of limits that are required now from the hospitality industry. Okay, clearly, a Corso on its own cannot take on that kind of exposure single-handedly, right? So this would definitely have to be more from an industry perspective. So it is available. I would say most likely limits for that are going to be challenged with regards to building up the appropriate limit that would be needed for that true exposure that I believe that COVID-19 really identified as a true problem overall.
Great, thank you, Mike. Gary, this one's right in your wheelhouse here. It's a question about reporting values. So when reporting values, is it acceptable to adjust for the fact that another of the company's plants can increase its production to cover for a damaged plant?
That's a great question, Chris. I'm actually glad somebody asked that. We always like to tell people, this is what I tell people, we want to give you credit for that kind of thing, but we want to see the pure BI exposure presented. So another example kind of leading into the question is sometimes people, especially big companies where maybe they have a lot of means, they have a lot of inventory, let's say, they'll take the inventory and they'll kind of reduce the BI value. And at the end of the day, we want to have we want to have the net sales minus the non-continuing expenses and have the pure number, but that doesn't mean that, I'm on the risk engineering side, but I was an underwriter for a few years. I understand the way it works, and there's certainly credits and debits that get taken in underwriting. And if a company helps us understand that, if they say, hey, look, we have 6 months of inventory, I want everyone on the call to realize that you do get credit for that. But if you kind of take it off the top, then a lot of times what happens is we even I hate to say it, but at times it's even missed where we don't even realize, and now everything that we're doing, the whole pricing of the insurance product and everything else, we just don't realize that it's this reduced BI number, and it just and then sometimes we double dip. We'll take credit then. We'll say, oh, look at all the great things they do to minimize their exposure. And we also look at that when it comes to how much capacity we want to take on an account. If you do a great job with all of this, we're more we're likely to say, hey, we'll take a bigger line size on your account. I don't know, Mike, if there's anything from your perspective that you want to add to that, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Gary. And I would just think about this also just from a PD perspective. Same way that we expect and we require 100% of those values. to be reported, although we understand that an MFL situation would be a lot less than that because the locations are, on different coasts. But we still need to start with 100% and then allow us to look at the single greatest risk that we have and then to deploy our capacity based on that and trust that we apply the appropriate credits and debits based on that information. So just like in BI, just like in PD, we start with 100% and then work with you to take it down to the true exposure and then allow us to fit the cover for that true exposure when it comes to terms and conditions and capacity, pricing, et cetera.
Thanks, Michael and Gary. Okay, so Gary, back to you. I'm going to actually go back to a slide that we looked at previously. There's a specific question related to this slide here. So here's the question, Gary. The second example with 2 buildings 50 kilometers apart, is that considered as CBI, so contingent business interruption?
Sure.
Our attendee, Gary, says, I'm thinking not since it's the same company's process flow, but please comment.
Right, sure. Yes, I'm sorry if this slide confused anyone. So in this example, we're assuming, the slide doesn't say it, but in this example, we're assuming that both of these plants are yours, but they're just 2 different locations on the statement of value. So in this case, Plant A and Plant B are actually 100% interdependent. So that's why it's, again, if you lose either plant, your full BI is exposed. But having said that, it is definitely important for people to understand that if Plant A is a supplier plant, it's still, so let's say Plant A is a supplier plant and Plant A burns down, it's still a $100 million BI exposure. Now that though would be CBI, right? So it's contingent because now Plant A is a supplier plant, so Plant A's loss, so it's a $100 million CBI exposure, I should say. In this example, we're saying, oh, these are both your plants, so it's an interdependent relationship between the 2 plants, so it's a BI versus CBI exposure. I hope that's clear enough.
Yeah, I certainly think so, Gary. Thank you for that. And question, Gary, I'm going to go back to you, and Mike, I'm sure you'll have something to add here. Definitely. Question, do you require complete COPE information for contingent locations? Sometimes international information is difficult to obtain. And I think maybe you could expand to kind of like the industry, what's the best practice for the industry in general, not necessarily just Swiss Re. Gary, can you comment on that?
Sure, I'll comment, but I definitely, after Mike, you can put your slant on this to see how you see it. But I know, for me, it really all depends on exactly how much coverage we're looking for here. So if I have a contingent BI, so I'm doing a risk review, and there's I mentioned these really high sublimits that you see, especially in the soft market. So we have a client and they want $150 million in CBI coverage. Of course, my advice to the underwriter is going to be, hey, we really need to have information on these suppliers, and maybe we don't want to, insure, third-tier suppliers, or we just want to have direct suppliers. So it really, I guess what I'm trying to say is it really depends on the exposure. If there's a big exposure, you want a lot of coverage for suppliers or, suppliers of suppliers, then we need to be able to not only understand the exposure, but then, yes, it's great if we can have an engineering report, for the key supplier site. I don't know that there's any hard and fast rule in industry. I do lots of reviews where we do get some reports on supplier facilities, but then there's certainly a lot of reviews I do where I know nothing about the suppliers other than maybe if they're named, right? Then I can see the names of them, and that's about it. But if if it's just a low coverage, you know, not asking for too much, we're not going to have a lot of participation. I might just say, okay, no problem. I'm in the dark on the suppliers, but I can accept it. So, Mike, I don't know if if you want to add something to that.
No, definitely. I would say, although there's no hard, fast rule, I would say the general practice that I've seen over my career from an underwriting perspective for Tier 1 is to treat them like an insured location. So clearly, as you said, Gary, one, if you're looking for significant coverage, significant limit to be provided by a key supplier, then clearly, yes, why would we not treat that like an insured location and maybe even go out, or probably even go out and provide an inspection, okay? And then to have that information and treat it just like that. Now that said, even if we're providing a reduced limit, what we have to be careful for is the accumulation effect. What if that is a key component? Again, what if it's a semiconductor? So I may only have a $5 million sublimit for this insured, but what if I have 10 insureds on 10 different policies that require it as well? So now it's a cumulative effect. So our goal is always to try to treat those as insured locations. But to the person who asked the question, yes, there are challenges, especially for international locations. Luckily, with availability of information to date, we are able to do searches and mapping and start to see, and even if it's satellite imaging, just start to understand where a facility is and understand more and more about it. So we're in better shape today than ever to try to get as much of that COPE information as we can for all suppliers and customers, clearly focusing on the Tier 1 and the largest valued first.
Great, thanks Michael and Gary.
Yeah, thanks.
A question for you, Gary. Has exposure information that you receive in submissions gotten better with time?
Well, that also varies quite a bit, and I'd say it varies depending a little bit on market conditions. It seems during the, so since the market has gotten a little bit, you know, harder, we have gotten a lot better. I'd say like most of the accounts I see now, we've been getting BI worksheets. And if we ask for something, if I say, hey, I really need a report for this location, or I need a BI worksheet for this location, it seems that, you know, right now with the conditions as they are, it's usually easier to get that information. When things are, you know, in the very soft market cycle, it seems that at times, you know, we just don't get the information, and but we always ask for it. So I don't know if it has been better lately, but I don't know if that's really a trend that's going to continue or not. I hope so.
Yeah, hopefully so. Back to your earlier point around the need for data and increased transparency. That's great. Thanks, Gary. Mike, there's a question here. You talked about NDBI cover. How can companies use parametrics to make their supply chains more resilient?
I almost feel like that question is also the answer, that they can, as we talked about NDBI, it could be two forms. It could be the traditional indemnity-based, or it could be set up as a parametric for those specific events that you're concerned about. So it would be event-based for those specific events. And it would also be, there would be a formula to figure out what that payout would look like. So that adds to the speed at which you would then recover in the event of a coverable event, and for that parametric to pay out. So I would say yes, and it can be set up that way. And at times we recommend it that way simply because it avoids some of the delays and the quicker ease of the claims payout at that time is critical for the insured at that time.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate that. Well, folks, that is all the time we have today. I want to again thank our guests, Michael LaRocca and Gary Johnson, for walking us through this discussion. I thought it was fantastic. Before you go, just a few important things. One is thank you for the audience for being great over the past hour. And we'd like you to please just take 2 seconds to complete this survey to let us know how we did. We want to be careful stewards of your time, and this will help shape the thought leadership and content we deliver to you. In the coming days, we had a lot of questions around this. In the coming days, we'll be sharing a recording of this webinar with everybody in the audience, so please feel free to view that and share as you would like. In the meantime, also, feel free to reach out to any one of us if you have additional questions. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. And lastly, we have a few upcoming events. So on May 25th, we'll have an event called From Adria to Will to Storm, Names to Know This Hurricane Season. So that'll be all about parametric named wind solutions and how corporates and public entities can utilize that product. And we talked about parametric in the presentation here. So this would be a great follow-up to this discussion here. And we also have previous webinars that we've recorded and are available on our website that you can access. Then on June 22nd, we'll talk about the economics of climate change. And that discussion will be led by our North American CEO, Yvonne Gonzalez, and our group chief economist, Jerome Hegley. Should be really interesting, extremely topical and timely discussion around the economics of climate change. So stay tuned for those invitations, and please follow Swiss Re Corporate Solutions on LinkedIn for updates and other thought leadership pieces. With that, I thank you all for being here and wish you a great rest of the week.